I think that will be a classic analysis and a reasonable one. I was suddenly free. During the sixth form, when I changed schools, actually, that my life became wider and easier and broader, and I discovered that I could actually be happy at school, which amazed me, frankly. Um, I had a gap year, which was a bit unusual, where I did some musical work and other stuff, and then yeah, coming up to Leeds University was like coming up for air. It was fantastic. Um, Now, this was 1974. Now, for a lot of us, the 60s really happened in the 70s. Yeah.
Right.
And yeah, in my case, it was sex, drugs, and Beethoven rather than rock and roll. But I spent a lot of time in the Faversham, the on campus pub, now and again in the Union Bar, and apart from that, huge amounts of time with, would you believe, the Light Opera Society, which doesn't, singing Gilbert and Sullivan, sound necessarily promising as a den of vice and iniquity, but it had its moments, believe me. Yeah. And I started with a lot of energy. Towards the end of my first year, I began to fall apart mentally. There was a specific trigger to this in the end, and that was to do with a theatrical production, oddly enough. A famous play, Peter Weiss's Marat, the full title of which tells you a good deal about it. The persecution and assassination of Marat as performed by the inmates of the asylum at Charenton under the direction of the Marquis de Sade. Yeah, a nice bright little number then. Well, I wrote the score for it and we did it. And it actually won the National Student Drama Festival that year. It was a fantastic, heart-stopping production. But I was on stage playing musical instruments, but playing the part of a lunatic for 3 hours a night as we did that. And by the end of the run, I couldn't put the lunatic bits back. I'd somehow had access to parts of myself. It was real method acting, I guess. And that and some emotional relationship problems, inevitably. Probably too much weed as well, maybe too much booze. And one night I just sort of cracked up, basically, and was sitting sobbing in a chair. And a doctor came out from student health department and took me in for the night, tranquilized me fairly heavily. And when I woke up about noon the next day, he was there sitting on the edge of my bed, and he looked at me and he said, "You look like you need a cigarette." That was proper doctoring, you know. He said, "We'll open the window so Matron doesn't find out." Then gave me one of his Rothmans. That was the beginning of a formal medical journey, if you like. Yeah.
It's interesting you say that, Roger, because recently I rewatched a documentary with Jim Carrey who talks about the difficulties of his mental health when he was playing the character Andy Kaufman. And I think the quote he says after was he was 6 months method acting intensely. And he came home and then he said he forgot who he was. He forgot what his political moral compass was. And it's interesting to hear you have a somewhat similar experience in that.
Yeah.
Can you talk us through the process of you being able to maybe find then who like regain this sense of self, I guess?
Yeah, if I ever do, I'll give you a call, okay? Dear God, it's an ongoing process. But there were significant moments and things that happened. And if you like, I can talk you through them. And some of that involves refinding faith of some sort as well, okay? During my time as a student, I should say, having finished my first year, cracked up, tried to start the second year and couldn't do it. I just wasn't fit mentally in any way to be able to undertake a rigorous path of study and lead something like a normal life. I was still searching for something which would make sense of it all, a sort of theory of everything, I guess. When you've been brought up within a very tightly structured system, as I had, once that's gone, it's like being cast adrift in an open boat. And I needed to find somewhere and somehow. I read endlessly. I remember reading particularly Ursula Le Guin, the Earthsea trilogy, and the first of those, where the protagonist turns and faces his fear, and then it flees from him. That spoke to my condition. I was reading the Tao Te Ching, central Taoist work. I was reading Solzhenitsyn, listening to Shostakovich, which is, Shostakovich, wonderful wrist-slashing music. It's fantastic. It's just, people think that having happy music helps when you're in the midst of depression. I do not find that. And I knew a string quartet who used to go and play in mental hospital, and they normally played a cheery bit of Mozart or Haydn or something. And one day they were short of rehearsal time and decided to play a bit of the Shostakovich they were rehearsing, and it had the most remarkable impact because it is grieving, yearning music coming out of Shostakovich's own mental health struggles throughout his life. And that spoke to the people who listened to it. Well, I found the same. It helped me. But in the middle of all this, I would go and talk to one friend in particular who seemed to understand. There were a whole group of us as students together, and we went and talked to this guy who was called John McKendrick. John was a brilliant poet and playwright. And he finished up as playwright of the National Theatre, playwright in residence. He understood. He understood somehow at a deep level and knew what to do and put me back together any number of times. And if things got really bad, I would call John. And then one morning, I got a phone call to say that he died and that he'd taken his own life. Now, I could draw a big line across my life before and after John's death because he was my role model and guru. I wanted to follow in his footsteps. And I suddenly realized then that if I followed in his footsteps, I was going to go over the same cliff. Well, I did what I always did at times of stress. I went to the pub. And it was the Faversham early doors, and there was only one other person there who, damn it, was the university chaplain. Now, this guy wearing a dog collar, I did not trust at all, but I knew him slightly because I'd done the odd concert there, And he was a man in his 50s, quite academic, quite dry, but also quite funny, as you're about to discover. And I went and sat with him and said, "How are you?" And he said, I can't get on with the church's calendar. They keep mucking around with it. It should be the third Sunday after Epiphany. Well, we've had Help the Aged Sunday, See Sunday, Single Parent Sunday. I'm going to have a fuck Sunday. Well, I nearly fell off my chair. I never heard my dear saintly father, bless him, say so much as damn. And Alan Overell took a deep drag on his cigarette and looked at me and smiled. He knew he'd got me. And he just looked at me and he said, "How are you?" Well, I trusted him and I told him, and it took a long time, a long, long time of telling. And at the end of my story, he just leant back and he tapped his collar and said, You need to be one of us. Now, I had walked into that pub pretty much an atheist. I wanted nothing to do with the church. And I walked out with the sense that I should be a priest. Isn't that weird?
Yeah.
It was as though the belief and vocation sort of came at the same time.
Sorry, how old were you, Roger, at this
Now,
point?
you could analyze. How old was I? I was about 23. Yeah. And you could say, okay, that would fit very neatly with the story you've told us about your childhood and your abandonment of that overarching structures that you had been brought up in, and you abandon it, and then at time of great stress you need to go back and take succor from that and take refuge in it. That may be true. I don't think it invalidates the truth that I found within it. Our motives are never unmixed.
Can you unpack that a little, Roger, that our motives are never unmixed? Because I think there's something great there.
Yeah, okay. I'll tell you in the context of where I am now, here in St. George's Crypt. We do our best to look after people who are homeless and vulnerable in Leeds. We have at the moment 15 residents staying in single rooms, socially isolating. Our dormitory would normally have accommodated 20 or 30 more. They are staying somewhere else with our staff looking after them. And we do lunch for about 100 people. But that's as well as another 25 who are living in 4 of our recovery houses. That's just the sort of surface of it, because we're not just providing a hot meal and a bed for the night, or indeed a shower, socks and underpants and whatever else they might materially need. We are trying to value each person who comes in and to tell them that their lives are valuable at a time when the rest of society may well be saying to them, you're a lump of shit, that they have nothing. They have nothing to offer and nothing to give, but that is never the case. I meet some of the most extraordinary, wonderful, beautiful, and just fantastic in every way, and interesting people in the city who come here. Yeah, I mean, yeah, they can be also rogues and villains. Who can be vicious, violent, and cruel to an extraordinary degree. But I know that capacity is in me also. It's in all of us. Now, we are there doing all this good stuff, looking after these homeless people. Whoopee-woo, that's fantastic. Well, you're doing a great job. Well done. And you could look at all that and say, yeah, but that gives you such a nice warm fuzzy when you've done it. You're really getting off on your good works. You like it when you go out of here and you say to people, I work at St. George's Crypt, and they say, oh, that's a fantastic work you're doing. I think that's brilliant. Yeah. And all that is really good. And all that exists, it is true. But it does not invalidate the good that we are able to do. Our motives are never unmixed.